Thank you guys for coming today. It's been 2 weeks today since we had orientation, and we talked a lot about the amount of reading you were going to have to do. So here we are. You now kind of have a sense after 2 weeks of what's expected of you in class. And so this is good timing for Dr. Cohen. For those of you who haven't met Dr. Cohen or interacted with him, he is the Vice Dean for Education and Academic Affairs at SAIS. He's for over 25 years. He's been a professor here in the Strategic Studies Department and really been responsible for that department's flourishing. He has written several books. He has written articles, op-ed pieces that often get picked up all over the place. He's a bit of a Twitter star as well. So anybody who produces that kind of information, that amount, probably consumes a lot too. So without further ado, let's find out the answer to this burning question of how to read a lot of stuff.
Thanks, Dave. Great, thank you. Okay, so hands up, how many of you are feeling overwhelmed by the amount of reading you have to do? Okay, at the moment I don't really care about you, it's the others that I'm really worried about. You have a psychological problem known as denial. And you need professional care, which I can't provide. So I'm going to talk to the people who raised their hands. So in part, this is going to be a talk about some survival skills, but actually only part, because I think the subject that I'm going to be discussing with you is really more important than that. I mean, you're all here for a graduate education, so you're going to learn about Heckscher-Ohlin, and you're going to learn what Clausewitz meant by the culminating point of victory, and have nuanced discussions about succession issues in Tajikistan. That's all an important part of what you can learn at SAIS. There's a lot more room up front. It's okay, and I don't bite, particularly you, Quinn, over there. But I believe, and actually I've been here 28 years, I believe that a critical part of your graduate education is actually stuff that's pretty basic. Learning how to read, learning how to write, learning how to speak, learning how to organize intellectual material. I'm just going to be talking about one of those dimensions, but all of those dimensions, that is really actually a very large part of what graduate education is about. All of us can always get better at those things. Me too. So today I'm just going to focus on one issue: how to read a lot of stuff, or in general, how to read. If you're going to buy one book, I suggest you go out and get a real classic, first published in 1940, but still in print, with an updated edition in 1972. It's by Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doren, How to Read a Book. Mortimer Adler was one of the founders of the great books idea at University of Chicago, then later at Aspen. Charles Van Doren, very famous professor of English. It is a great book, not just about reading books, but largely about reading books. If you're going to get another book, I would recommend Thomas Mann, not Thomas Mann as in Magic Mountain and Buddenbrooks, but Thomas Mann, a librarian, which is a very honorable profession, let me clarify that. But Thomas Mann, who's the former chief research librarian at the Library of Congress, called The Oxford Guide to Library Research. That's a very helpful book. That's particularly as you think about research. So, okay, the basic premise is, as I said, you're overwhelmed, I'm overwhelmed. Let me just tell you something, as somebody who's been around longer than you have, it's just going to get worse, okay? None of this is going to get any better. You will be obliged to read more and more stuff the further you get along. Also, I'm not qualified to teach speed reading, and I'm not sure I entirely believe in it. Rather, what I want to do is talk about intelligent technique for your course reading, for your research, for reading the news, for professional, and even to some extent for recreational reading beyond what you have to do here. Let me begin with there are plenty of seats up front, don't be bashful. I think you always want to have three basic questions in mind when you're reading anything. First, it has to do with self-awareness. Why am I reading whatever it is that I am reading? Am I reading to extract one piece of information? Am I reading to try to capture an idea? Am I reading to try to figure out where an author stands on a particular issue? Am I reading to figure out who they really are? You may have many purposes for reading. Be self-aware what those are. Subject awareness. What am I reading? Am I reading a memoir, an autobiography, a history? Now, all this may sound completely obvious, but actually it's not, because most of us, when we read, we just pick up the thing that we're supposed to read and we begin with the first line and go all the way through without asking ourselves any questions. The third question, which is particularly important, I think, for students, has to do with time management. How much time do I have to read? I'm going to talk a little bit later on about the importance of habit. But one habit that's good to get into at the very outset of your graduate career is when you got a pile of stuff to read, figure out a time budget and stick to it, which will be uncomfortable. Again, most of us are used to the idea you pick something up, you begin at the beginning, and at some point, you know, one beer and a pizza later, you come out at the very end. That's not the way to do it. I'm going to give this article 15 minutes. I'm going to give this book 45 minutes. Now, you'll adjust and so on, but that is, you know, it's pretty horrifying, I know. But it'll make your life a lot easier if you just get in the habit of saying, I'm going to give each of these things this amount of time, and then, of course, you adjust. What are some of the basic principles that are involved? Well, the first, I would say, is the idea of variable speed reading. You should read at different paces. You don't want to be like somebody has a bicycle that has only one gear, which again is how most of us are. And whether it's, you know, the back of a box of Cheerios or Plato's Symposium, you're going to read it all at the same speed. That's not the way to do it. The great Elizabethan scholar and statesman Francis Bacon, who wrote a wonderful little essay on reading that includes these lines. Some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested. That is, some books are to be read only in parts, others to be read but not curiously, and some few to be read wholly and with diligence and attention. Absolutely right. There are some things you can go through very quickly, and other things you really don't want to go through very quickly. And again, it's going to require you to force yourself to decide at what speed am I going to force myself to go through this thing. Second major principle from particularly Adler and Van Doren stress this: active reading. Don't put your mind in neutral as you're reading, which many of us do. I put my mind in neutral and read either directions for doing magic tricks or a guide to baking bread before I fall asleep. And then I do put my mind in neutral because I just want to kind of glide off into Never Never Land. But at any other time, you should be very well aware of what you're reading, why you're reading it, and engaging with what you're reading. One implication of this: don't reserve reading for a time when you're tired. I mean, if you're somebody like me who's up early and gets sleepy relatively early as well, I don't do my serious reading late in the afternoon or in the evening. I'm not going to be an effective reader then. Third principle, again from Adler and Van Doren, the importance of coming to terms with an author. That's the phrase they use, coming to terms with an author. Knowing what it is that he or she thinks they're writing about, knowing what the particular terms that they use, that it may be some piece of jargon, or it may be a particular phrase that means something to them, what those terms mean to them, and how they have defined their subject. Now, you'll notice that what I'm very careful to do is say how they have chosen their terms, how they understand their subject, what they think they're writing about. You may disagree with the author about all this. You may think those terms are not particularly useful. You may think that they should have written a very different kind of book or article. That's not the point. The first step in active reading is understanding, okay, who is the author and what do they think that they are up to? And then you're going to add your layer of interpretation onto that. Fourth principle, a favorite phrase of mine from William James, the great American psychologist, who I'll be mentioning a little bit further on. William James is, to my mind, actually the greatest of American psychologists, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. He wrote a wonderful little book called Talks to Teachers, which I recommend to every new teacher at any level. And one of the things he says is no impression without expression. That is to say, you should never simply absorb information or an idea without then doing something. What does that mean? Do something when you read. That might be writing a summary of the article or the book, and that may only be a couple of sentences or even a couple of phrases. It may be actively making marginal notations. It may be talking to somebody about it. But do something active with what you have read, even if it's minimal. That, among other things, and I think the psychologist would confirm this, that actually helps fix it in your mind. Otherwise, it's just going to flow right through there. By the way, this is the same reason why it is a terrible idea to take notes in class using a laptop. I see all the people with laptops going. Because what that does is it turns you into a stenographer. If you write notes, then you're actually thinking about what you're hearing, because you can't be my stenographer when you're doing it. It's also why, quite apart from the legal issues, you don't want to simply tape classes or and listen to them. That's not the same thing as working on the material. By the way, throw out your highlighters. Highlighters, I think, are awful. So let me tell you why highlighters are awful. Highlighters are awful because all it can tell you is this passage is yellow, right? It can't say this is really important, this is really stupid, this contradicts something that the author said somewhere else. It just tells you this passage is yellow. Now, there are people who think that they can get past that by having just an amazing array of colored highlighters, okay? Then they begin to confuse themselves with the French Impressionists, and that's not very helpful either. And after a while, I mean, it really takes you to the further point of madness, and then you just end up, and I have seen people who think, okay, well, yellow means this, and blue means that, and red means that, and they just end up with a kind of paint by numbers version of a page which is multicolored and perhaps aesthetically appealing, but really is not useful. So what should you use? Pencil. I'm in favor of a pencil. Not particularly picky about the lead. I prefer a 0.9 millimeter lead. Other people prefer the 0.5 millimeter lead. Usually, actually, I use this pen. If I steam, I'm rich, I can afford a fountain pen. With you will at some point in your lives, maybe. After you pay off the loans. With a really fine point and red ink, and develop your own system for taking notes. But even just things like check marks, exclamation points, question marks, X's when I think this is wrong, writing in the margin, CF period, which means, but compare what they say here. So make it your own. Don't do this with library books. Don't do this with library books. I should make a point of that. But this, by the way, is also one of the reasons why I personally think you're much better off reading paper. There are a number of reasons why you're much better off reading paper than electrons. I know many people prefer to have everything on an iPad, and yes, I've got an Apple Pencil too. As I told you, I'm a Vice Dean, therefore I'm rich. But the truth is, as good as the Apple Pencil is, it's still not the same thing as having a pencil or a fine-pointed pen. Also, it's possible to drop an iPad and have something very bad happen to it. You drop a book, you just pick it up. Fifth principle, consider the source. I mentioned that you have to come to terms with the author. You do, quite frequently, want to know, okay, who is the author? Now, bear in mind as you do that, that somebody who you think is a dreadful person may be offering up a profound insight. Somebody who routinely lies may be telling the truth. Somebody who is a meticulous scholar may be purveying something that is profoundly untrue. So you have to think about it. You may want to think, when did they write? What were they referring back to? You do have to think about who the author is. And of course, these days, it is one of the advantages of living in the internet age. You can figure out who the author is. Principle number 6, use the library, or more importantly, the librarians. Sheila Thalheimer back there. Jenny Gelman, where are you? Want to stand up and wave at these people? Hey, do we have anybody else from the library here? Librarians are great. They really are great. It is one of the great strengths of SAIS. And they will be very helpful to you. And they've been working with people like you for years and years. Most of them have been around here for quite a while. Some of them even went here. And they will be able to give you a lot of help. The final principle, make habit your ally. Develop supportive routines for when and how to read. And I say that particularly in the internet age, when everybody has the attention span of a hummingbird, and we're all being distracted by tweets. That's why I flinched when Steve said that about how I'm a Twitter ninja master. Our brains are being rewired quite literally to give us shorter attention spans. That is true. Make habit your ally. If you want to read a great essay on habit, again, I will refer you to William James, who wrote what was for many, many years the standard textbook on psychology. There's a 2-volume version, and there's something called Psychology, the briefer course. You can find it in many, many editions. It's on the web. He has a chapter on habit. And there are many beautiful lines in it, which I won't trouble you with right now. But one of his points at the end of a particular riff is he says, "We are spinning our own fates, good or evil, and never to be undone." He believed in the power of habit. So develop whether it's the time that you're going to read, for how long you're going to read, where you're going to read. Make habit your ally. And he has some interesting guidelines for how you do that. Okay, what's the nature of the challenge that you have, particularly thinking about coursework at SAIS? And again, this is a profound part of your education. Being an open-minded but skeptical reader, something of which we are in profoundly short supply at the moment. So how to think about that in an academic context? Well, one thing is you're going to have to learn to read scholarly materials, because that's actually a lot of what you're going to be looking at. And you're going to have to learn some things about, for example, how academic debates evolve about different subjects. And what you will discover is in just about any given subfield or subfield, there is kind of a conventional wisdom or a normal theory, and then somebody steps up and says, no, that's all wrong. And then there's a big argument, and then you move to another consensus, and so it goes. It is often important to be able to place what you're reading in that kind of context. There will be conventional wisdom and cracks at it. Consensus is sort of a pendulum. And let me explain, and Professor Murtha, who I see at the back, will confirm this, the great principle of academic life. So, young academics invariably commit parricide. Parricide is when you kill your parents. Okay? That is the fundamental motivation of young faculty members. I know, because I did it myself. I mean, I didn't actually kill Sam Huntington, who I revered, but He was Mr. Civil Military Relations. He wrote this very famous book, The Soldier in the State, which is still in print. It's going to be in print long after I'm forgotten, with a particular approach to civil military relations. And I wrote a book called Supreme Command, which says, you know what, the fundamental, what I called the normal theory, which is the Huntingtonian theory, is really profoundly flawed. That is how academic debates go. A younger generation of scholars looking at the same material, sometimes it's additional material or new material, same material viewed in different ways, will say, you know, that interpretation we had, not so. Right now I'm reading about the history of the occupation of France during World War II and resistance and so on. Very striking to me how you can see the pendulum swings of interpretation among historians of that. When you approach scholarly literature, you want to know, you're looking at a particular field, there are usually going to be some fundamental works or monographs that everybody kind of bounces off of. Whether they should or they shouldn't is not the point. Whether those works are particularly good or not is variable. But that's usually the way an academic debate proceeds. There's somebody who's written a core text, say Sam Huntington on civil military relations, it's The Soldier in the State, and everybody else is bouncing off it. Or there's a kind of a theory that everybody believes, everybody else is bouncing off it. You want to figure out what those fundamental works are, or monographs or articles, and take a good look at them because you'll see that a debate forms around it. Bear in mind that when somebody says such and such is really the definitive work on X, you can be almost 100% sure that it is not. It will be reinterpreted. There are major reinterpretations of the end of the Roman Empire that are going on right now. There are major reinterpretations of why did World War I end the way it did. And it's not that there's been a shortage of scholarship on these matters. So very rarely are scholarly debates ever closed. How can you tell when you're dealing in the scholarly literature with a problematic piece of scholarship? Well, for me, there are a couple of warning flags. One is when you read somebody and you realize they really can't treat the opposing position with any kind of respect. When somebody's really kind of a monomaniac and everybody who disagrees with me is wrong, just thoroughly, totally, utterly wrong. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are wrong, but it's a good indication that maybe not. When somebody has a hobby horse, when somebody there's one theme that they're just going to keep on coming back to no matter what, in every possible context, you're dealing with a monomaniac. And there are plenty of academic monomaniacs out there. When somebody rewrites the book, same book, or the same article over and over again, you should also be wary. It's something I've always dreaded in my academic career. But when you see somebody basically rewriting the same thing over and over again, the chances are they are not the most imaginative, creative, insightful, thoughtful scholar around. Footnotes. I'm sure you've already had discussions about footnotes in the context of plagiarism and so on. Frequently, academic battles are conducted kind of like medieval siege warfare in tunnels underneath the earth. And that's usually the footnotes. And that's where particularly German scholars get the most vicious. You're just trying to crush each other with their pedantry in the footnotes. And there are plenty of, that's really spread around the world. So depending on the journal, there's some journals which just love to have vast quantities of footnotes in which the most scathing repartee is going back and forth. Be aware of that. Sometimes actually you can learn a lot about the state of agreement or disagreement in a field by looking at the footnotes and see where the battle line's being drawn. Finally, beware of educated stupidity. I would put Google Scholar right up there on that one. Beware of fads, beware of orthodoxies. If everybody thinks X, my instinct is to say you're wrong. Even if I don't have a whole lot of evidence, you be wary of orthodoxies. Now, sometimes, the world is round, and that is the orthodoxy, and you're probably not going to get all that far by insisting that, no, we should take seriously the possibility that the world is flat. But often, when you're dealing with contentious issues, and most of the things you'll be studying at SAIS are contentious one way or another, an orthodox view has some weaknesses in it that need to be thought through. Okay, let's talk about some of the materials that one reads. A book. What I'm about to say is really right out of Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doren. The phrase they use is X-ray a book before you read it. What does that mean? Look at the title. How often have you read a book and somebody says, what's that book you're reading? And you can't remember the title. Title's very important. It can tell you a lot. Look at the table of contents. How have they divided their work? Look at the index. Most of us don't look at the index until we actually have to go look something up. If you flip through the index, you'll get some sense of what are the topics that the author has lavished a lot of time on. So it's worth doing that. Read the introduction and conclusion carefully, particularly if the introduction is where the author is setting up their argument. Look at the footnotes. The footnotes will tell you a lot about what kind of research they've done. By the way, one of the great things about the technology you have available to you is RefWorks. Use that to build your bibliographies. What makes a serious book? How do you know that the book you're reading is actually a respectable book? That might have something to do with the publisher. If it's an academic press, it's probably gone through some vetting process. Usually, the academic presses, say a Harvard University press or a Hopkins University press, will have outside readers who will review a manuscript anonymously, and they will sometimes kill books. I mean, I recently saw a book published, which I'd read for a major press. I read the manuscript, and I said, this author, Harvard had asked me to review it, and I said, this author has clearly not done their homework. And I think their other external reviewer said that as well. And even though they saw some commercial possibilities in it, they said, we're not going to publish it. The chances are, actually, for the most part, you'll not be reading books, although you may read some. What about journals? Well, the big distinction in the academic world is between refereed journals and non-refereed journals. That doesn't mean things that are worth reading, things that are not worth reading. But if I write an article for Foreign Affairs, it's basically up to the editor whether or not they're going to publish it. And any fact-checking or so on will be done internally. If I write an article for international security or world politics or something like that, it is refereed. That means that they go through the process of sending the article out anonymously without the name attached to at least 2 academic reviewers. And academics view this as something you're just supposed to do. You're supposed to look at refereed articles. Again, that doesn't mean that the article is great. It just means it's been through a particular process. And if you're reading a journal article, again, remember what I said. You're probably watching somebody engage in a much larger debate about something. And you want to get that context right. What about the news? You'll be reading a lot of the news. So a couple of things there. Any journalists here? Good. Can any of you say what the inverted pyramid is? Right. So what journalists do is, because in the old days you could not, in the pre-online world, you didn't know how long the story was going to be. And that really just had to do with the typesetting and stuff. And it could be cut off anywhere. The idea is you have the big ideas up at the top and more details and kind of narrower and narrower stuff further down. It's a very particular way of writing and still very much practiced in newspapers like the Washington Post or the New York Times. By the way, there are a lot of different kinds of literary styles. That's one of them. You should be aware that that's how they do it. Remember that aggregators know what you like and what you're interested in. So just because you look at Google News doesn't mean you're getting a neutral news feed. They are, in a way, pandering to you in an organized kind of way, which is kind of insidious. Be aware of the trend to bias, but it can still be news. So I try to read The Guardian pretty regularly, even though I loathe its politics. You should read some news outlet whose politics you really don't like. I'm not trying to send you all off to Breitbart, don't worry, but you should get in the habit of reading a news organ that you find reprehensible, because a partisan press does not always mean a non-factual or completely dishonest press. Okay, it means a motivated press, and it may mean a dishonest press, but there can be interesting stuff, and it's good to be exposed to things you don't like. Always be aware when you're reading the news, particularly when we're talking about leaks from administrations or foreign governments. Sometimes this is just incredibly hard work by journalists who are relentlessly pursuing stories and wearing themselves out, you know, knocking on doors and so on. More often, my belief, stand to be contradicted by the journalists, it's somebody texting or calling or emailing a journalist and saying, do I have a story for you? And so as you read the news, you may want to think, why is somebody sharing the information that's in this story with this particular outlet? And there can be all kinds of reasons for that. Gray literature. Not everything, let me say this twice. Not everything is on Google. Not everything is in Wikipedia. All kinds of stuff that isn't there. One of the things that Google and you know, Bing or DuckDuckGo or whatever it is that you use will often not pick up is the so-called gray literature. What do we mean by gray literature? Well, for example, the RAND Corporation does all kinds of reports about all sorts of things for the federal government. Those are all available as PDFs on the RAND website because it's paid for by the taxpayer. Unless it's classified, then it won't be there. And there are many, many other institutions that do this. Some of this is very high quality material. RAND, for example, when it issues a report, goes through a blind refereeing process. So it's not that this isn't serious stuff. It can be very serious stuff. But be aware that the gray literature exists. Think about World Bank reports, all sorts of things, which are not journal articles, they're not books, they may not show up in Google, but they can be very useful. Official reports. And bear in mind, they're not always truthful, they're not always whitewashes. One of my courses, I talk a lot about this. I'll say one of the things that you want to bear in mind when you read an official report is, what were the terms of reference for this report? First, what caused it to be written? Was this just the bureaucracy sort of spinning the way it normally does? Was this initiated by somebody? Was the person or the team writing the report given a set of guidelines about what they were supposed to write about? Those are all important questions. Sometimes the terms of reference will be very explicit, sometimes they'll be implicit, and sometimes the explicit terms of reference are actually not the real terms of reference. What I just said about terms of reference applies even more when you're reading official documents. Again, one of the miracles of the internet, whether you're dealing with the contemporary world or with history, is there is now a vast amount of government documentation available online. And I'm not just talking about for now. I'm talking about if you're doing 18th century work on the 18th century, it is astounding how much stuff the British National Archives have put out there. So there are vast quantities of primary sources out there. And when you have an opportunity, you should take advantage of that. And for all kinds of reasons, among other things, it'll give you a sense of how organizations actually function. The key question to ask about any official document is this: why did this document come into existence? Was this just a matter of bureaucratic routine? If it was a bureaucratic routine, what was the nature of the bureaucratic routine that was driving this? Was this driven by people wanting to keep some kind of financial accountability? Was it possibly somebody trying to dish a bureaucratic rival? Why does this document exist? Remember the definition of a primary source, and this is, I think, very important. A primary source is any kind of document that was created for some purpose other than influencing the historical record. There are documents that are created with the purpose of influencing the historical record, how an event will be remembered. A document which is not created for that purpose is, in some sense, a primary source. So, these lecture notes. I mean, there's no original research here. I mean, a lot of it is lifted from Mortimer Adler and Francis Bacon and William James. It would be a primary source if, for some bizarre reason, somebody wanted to write my biography and wanted to talk about what kind of lectures did Dean Cohen give. Because I really didn't prepare these notes with a view to influencing, what people thought about me at some other time. Again, remember there can be multiple motivations for the creation of documents, and sometimes the most interesting line on the original piece of paper, if that's what it is the blank copy line, BCC. That means here are all the other people to whom this document was addressed, but the other addressees don't know anything about that. By the way, if you're doing documentary research, one way to think about it, and I would encourage all of you, no matter what your concentration is, find some way to engage with primary materials. One way to do that is imagine the sources that you would like to have exist and see if they actually do exist. And you will be surprised. I would like to figure out if this statesman kept a diary. It would be really helpful to me if there was some kind of log that was kept by this submarine or something like that. And then go out and see if those documents exist. And as I said, you'll be surprised. Okay, last item that I want to discuss is the importance, despite the fact that you're all overwhelmed, of reading for things outside the classroom. Says the guy who assigns 300 pages a week. Why? First, I think broad reading gives you the opportunity to inhabit other worlds. A newly promoted major in the United States Army came to me last year asking for advice about how to prepare for the rest of her career. And my advice was read widely and read beyond issues of immediate relevance. History, novels, something that will make you bigger and wiser and opposed to a wider range of human thought and behavior. Someone once said about history that the past is a different country. Well, if there's one thing that is true of SAIS students is they are all great travelers. You all are great travelers. One way of traveling is reading history, reading novels, reading serious books about other times and places. Remember, too, that during any career you need to grow, and that one of the habits that will help you grow is just that. Secondly, read in order to learn how to write. I haven't really given you a harangue about writing, although I can do that too. The best way to learn to write clearly and effectively is to do an awful lot of it and have a brutal editor. But if you also develop a taste for good writing, you will find that subconsciously rhythms and metaphors will come in that make you a better writer because you are a better reader. And the chances are that the writing style you like as a reader will be one that in some indirect ways influences you as a writer. Who should you read? Completely up to you. Just find something you like. I tend to the Brits. I like Hazlitt, I like Orwell, but you might decide you like the great writers of The New Yorker during the 1940s, people like A.J. Liebling. You might like John McPhee. There are plenty of people. Just find something that really appeals to you and ask yourself, why do I like it so much? And you'll find that seeping in. Read poetry, which is really kind of the distilled juice of reality. Poetry can make you a better writer as well. Thirdly and finally, remember that there are books to be read carefully, to be read in a linear way, beginning at the beginning and going through all the way to the end, even if it takes a lot of time. Thucydides or Clausewitz or Shakespeare, that's class unto itself. The challenge, I think, is to know what is ephemeral, what is only partly important, and what is really worth losing yourself in. One thing that is disturbing is, as I said, because of the internet age, a lot of people are losing the experience that I still cherish about my own boyhood, which was long afternoon completely lost in a book. Completely lost in a book. And if you have the opportunity to, and it takes time to get used to that idea, but it can be a profound experience. Remember, finally, that we are often overwhelmed because we have forgotten what is quality and what is not. In short, we lack good judgment. Education is about many things, but one of them is definitely about developing good judgment. And that, I believe, should be part of what your experience here should be all about. So that's what I have to say. We've got another 15, 20 minutes, and I'm happy to take any questions, comments, whatever you like. Until then. Yes?
I have a microphone.
There's a microphone. Actually, it's Ms. Thalheimer is running to you with the microphone. Yeah.
I tend to agree with you on annotations, but I use a computer a lot. The reason just being I like a centralized place to put all my notes for all the things
Yes.
I read. How do you manage that without using a thing like a computer, for example?
So I think the way to do it is, to the extent you can mark things up, I would mark things up as you read them. And then write notes, which you keep in the computer. I mean, that's how when I do research for a book, or an article for that matter, I will do that. I'll have a separate folder, maybe with a whole bunch of subfolders, and it is a good idea. By the way, keep everything you have in the cloud, because those things do crash. Yes? Oh.
My name is
Later.
Sebastian. If you had to recommend 2 books for every size student, what would they be?
A short book and a really long book. The short book would be the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius, usually considered the last of the good emperors, a Stoic, and by Stoic, not a philosopher, not in the way that we think of philosophy as an absent-minded professor, but somebody who's thinking about how to live your life. And the Meditations were notes and thoughts that he kept mainly as he was on campaign on the borders. And first, I think there's a lot. I'm a non-practicing Stoic myself. There's a lot to be said for Stoicism, but there's also the way in which he approaches his life experience. So the first chapter of the Meditations is, I learned this from my grandfather. I learned that from my father. I learned that from my friend. He's thinking about the people who made an impression on him. So that would be the short one. The long one, which is completely self-indulgent, but I don't care, would be Winston Churchill's biography of the Duke of Marlborough. It's only 6 volumes. Still in print, and it's really good. It's Winston Churchill, after all. Churchill wrote it in the late 20s and 30s, when he's out of government. It is beautifully written. It is a great statesman meditating on the nature of statesmanship. The Duke of Marlborough had been his great ancestor, of course. It is good history. I have a colleague who's an historian at Syracuse University who is an expert on Marlborough. He said it's still the best book out there. But what it is fundamentally as I said, a great statesman thinking about the nature of statesmanship by writing about another statesman?
Yeah, just for me, sometimes the difficulty is maintaining that motivation. I mean, you want to have that motivation to become habit, but sometimes if you're reading something that is so verbose, so
Yep.
ostentatiously written, I just
Yep.
you have to read it because it's like the cornerstone of the book of the course. But how do you maintain or regain that? Motivation?
I think the way to deal with really tedious, boring stuff is first, at a suitable moment, you might want to let the faculty know that, this is really horrible stuff. I mean, I would usually wait till after the grading period is over. But I think the best way to deal with that, and sometimes we have to read stuff that we don't like, we don't particularly enjoy reading. The way to deal with that is with what I was talking about, time limit. If the chances are, if it's really horrible, there are probably only a few big ideas in there that you really need to extract from it. So force yourself to do that. So I would try to reduce the amount of time that you spend on it to the extent that you can. Obviously, it all depends on circumstances. Yes?
This is sort of a related question, but I find that even though I can read quite quickly, if it's a book that I'm worried is extremely consequential all the time, like very important, like I'm reading On War right now, it takes me very long to get through it because I'm worried that if I move faster, then some key point I'll miss. So it can take a very long time. Do you have any recommendations for how to develop the mental discipline or the courage to try to move faster through a really serious book?
Take your time on Clausewitz. I mean, no, the truth is Clausewitz is a great work. It is not always the clearest thing. Give yourself permission to take time. If you have reasonably concluded that this is a great and really important work, give yourself permission to take time. That's okay. Don't beat yourself up about that. It just makes sure that on the other things that you have to read, like non-strategic studies kinds of readings, that you're exercising discipline about time. Also, the other thing to bear in mind is a really great book, which On War is, like reading Macbeth or War and Peace or Brothers Karamazov or something. The great books are there to be reread. They're there to be reread. And there's a chapter to be written about the joys of rereading and seeing things that you didn't see before. And of course, your own life experience changes you, so you see things that you wouldn't have seen at an earlier stage in your life. So bear in mind that you'll be doing that you will be rereading this. Yeah. I think it is fair to say that in general, the quality of writing has deteriorated. The average quality of writing has deteriorated. When you look, for example, there's the Library of America has done a great job of putting together the journalism of World War II. It's phenomenal. It is really powerful writing. And people who think that the home front didn't have a vivid sense of what was going on the front lines don't understand what the power of the word was in a reading culture. That said, there are a lot of good writers who are out there today. There are a lot of good journalists who write compelling journalistic prose. There are a lot of good essayists out there. I write a lot for The Atlantic. I like The Atlantic. I read The New Yorker. Sometimes they drive me crazy, but I think they're quite good. There are plenty of good historians or students of politics and so on who are out there. So, as long as human beings care about the written word, there'll be good writing. But there's a lot more, forgive me, crap out there than there used to be. And part of that also is because it's so easy to publish, in a way. And the problem with the internet is you no longer have to be disciplined about length. I mean, with a kind of a curated site, then you frequently do. They'll give you word limits. But it's not like, say, writing an op-ed for a newspaper where they really do have word limits that force people into concision. One of the most useful kinds of experiences you can have here in terms of writing is classes that will set upper limits on how long a piece is. If anybody who ends up taking my class in the spring semester, Art of Strategic Decision, will discover that if your memo is longer than 2 pages, I rip off everything else and say this thing lacks a conclusion, redo it. Yes?
So for your advice on intelligent technique, I think that it might actually take longer for me to do some of those things than to just jump in and read it. So can you provide some guidance into like time management techniques specifically related to some like shortcuts or something for the intelligent technique questions?
For the intelligence?
Intelligent technique questions, like the why am I reading, who am I reading, and things like that.
It's habit. It really is habit. Look, there are people who have challenges which just have to do with neuroscience in terms of reading, and I've had students like that. I mean, I had a student who was dyslexic, and he said it was very impressive. He came up to me at the beginning of the semester, and he said, I can listen very, very carefully. I'm not going to be able to read as much as I would like to, because that's not how my brain works, who did wonderfully well, because he was a phenomenal listener, and because he worked really hard. But I think with setting aside things where there's really a condition, and there are, and the university, by the way, has resources to help. If you know somebody who's dealing with those issues, the university has resources to help, and we all understand that that's reality. For the rest, I think it is very much plunge in and develop habit. William James, again, you might want to read that chapter on habit from the psychology. One of his points is, once you decide to establish a new habit, don't tolerate any deviation from it for a while until it's really hardwired into you. And he's actually anticipating a lot of the stuff we now know about brain science. One last one. Yes? Actually, maybe we could just get the microphone.
Hi, I'm Rebecca.
Hi.
I'm curious in regards to how you consume news, if you think it's more effective to know a little bit about everything over many, many different sources, or sort of pick your 2 favorite maybe partisan publications and kind of know both things on each side and be a little more focused in your news consumption that way.
So again, a matter of routine. So my normal routine in the morning is I fire up my iPad. I will look through the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and if I have time, the Financial Times. I will not read every article. I will kind of pick and choose. And then, I'll usually kind of curse a little bit and then move on to the next thing. Beyond that, I find if I read those 4 newspapers, except I'm reading them electronically, I tend to feel I've got a pretty good view of the world. Now, later on in the day, what I'll be doing is I may be reading specialized newsletters. So, for example, I had an exchange with Professor Murtha about one called Sinosism, which is by a man named Bill Bishop, which I just think is really interesting on China. So I will follow that. And there are other things of that ilk where I'll take a look at, and some of them in the defense world, which I will at least scan. I mean, there again, one of the things to force yourself to do, and in this way the internet age does help, is you can look at a page and kind of take it in pretty quickly and say, okay, that one I think I'm going to drill further down into. And then I think the thing that's really important is periodically, every 6 months, every year, I don't know what, step back and saying, okay, am I looking at the right things? Are there magazines that I should be subscribing to, electronically or in reality, that I don't? Am I actually ever reading this particular newsletter? And then be decisive about unsubscribing or letting the subscription lapse. So again, it's a question, I think, of being self-conscious about what you're doing. There's no particular recipe other than that. Okay, I think it's 6 o'clock. Good luck, everybody.